Hi guys, it's Wednesday, October 5th, 4:14 p.m. and I'm super excited about what I'm about to talk about. So, I have stepped into a temporary calling here. So last week, this is what sparked this whole thing. Last week we were talking about the virtues and we read the visions of Saint Hildegard, a couple of them, and we were discussing how this triumph that the church is about to have will be perpetuated, I guess you can say, or accomplished through personal holiness. And that is what is going to squash the evil forces, among other things. But that's really what we were focusing on. And so, with that being said, obviously, personal holiness, as we talked about, the first requirement there is faith, and frequenting the sacraments, especially living in a state of grace, but then also the virtues, obtaining these virtues, asking for these virtues, working on natural virtue, fasting, these sort of things, in conjunction with, obviously, the supernatural means that are given to us by God through the church. And then on this whole idea of triumphs, I hit a little bit on Father Don Dolindo, mostly because somebody had asked me what my personal belief is about the timeline and things like that. And I had pointed out that he sees these two triumphs. The first triumph being that of the earthly church here on earth, which is what we are facing right now. So we are facing a purging and a triumph. So with that being said, there was only one book. For those of you who don't know who Don Dolindo is, I'm going to read about him in a minute. But I realized when trying to dig deeper on this stuff, it's very limited in the English speaking world. And even I'm trying to get my hands on some of his original writings, even in Italian. I have somebody that can help me translate them, but I can't even seem to find them in Italian. And there is some sort of weird thing going on with it, I'm pretty sure. Because once you start hearing what he's talking about, you'll understand why the church doesn't want these things to get out. So, anyway, my first appeal is if you know of anybody who studies Father Don Dolindo Rotullo or has access to his writings, even if they are in Italian, and I'm specifically looking for his commentary on the New Testament. He has commentary on some in the Old Testament, such as the book of Maccabees, which I believe is translated into English. Not sure on that one. I know for sure the only one that I have come across, other than chapter 11 of the Apocalypse, is Luke. The Gospel of Luke is translated into English. So if you know of any more that have been translated or how I can get my hands on even the Italian, I believe the book is La Scrittura, I believe is what he named it. Please drop a comment below and I will be happy to do that. But for now, what I'm having to do is find videos of Italian priests reading his works, who have studied his works, that are reading his works, and I'm having to turn the closed captions on at the bottom in the auto translation into English and then piece it together that way. So this is going to be a slow process. I found one priest called Padre Settimio Maria Manelli. There we go. I almost sound Italian, right? And the Italian I know is these priests would never say. So we know like stata zit and some other colorful language that obviously I'm not going to hear out of the words of this very holy Padre Settimio Maria Manelli. But anyway, he has put together this whole conference on specifically the apocalypse. Again, there's no information virtually on this in the English speaking world. So I now understand this calling I was being given, this task I was being called to by Father Don, I think, to get his writing out in English. Because again, he's pretty well known in Napoli and Naples, which that's where my DNA resides from, the Kingdom of Naples. Um, and so he is a servant of God. His cause is open for canonization, and he's pretty, I wouldn't say very well known in Italy, but more well known than here. For example, the locals in Naples go to his tomb to knock 3 times for his help. So he has a good reputation as being a very holy man, a living saint when he was alive, and now, like I said, we're open for canonization. With that being said, other housekeeping things. I did a video this morning on ways you can support me through Patreon in just a one-time donation. And as far as Patreon is concerned, people will have access to exclusive content. And I left that kind of open-ended. The content I think that I will be making available, sending to people, will be my outline of what I have translated. So basically, it's going to be what I'm reading from on these videos. I'm going to send to people on Patreon so that way you have it and you can disseminate that. This is going to take me some time, but it will happen before the end of the quarter. So, without further ado, let's read about Father Don Dolindo Rutulo. And again, I believe I am being called to do this. Oh, but it does go in line, getting back to the virtues. So here's where it all ties together. He's very big on the corruption of virtues, corrupting the church, basically, causing these trials and these persecutions, but which will result in the triumph. And really, his whole take on the book of the Apocalypse is not technical. It's not a technical manual of being able to get it right and identify this beast and what that's doing and the timeline and all this stuff. It's a pastoral approach, which is, I think, exactly what we need right now, because we tend to get bogged down in these arguments of what does this figure symbolize and blah blah blah, and we're so worried about getting it right that we forego the whole purpose of God revealing this book, is to inspire virtue, is to give us hope in times of persecution and things like this. So without further ado, let's read about Father Don Dolindo Rutulo, 1882 to 1970, and pictured is an image with him and Padre Pio, who he was friends with. His cause for canonization is currently open. He is officially known as Servant of God. He was born in Naples in 1882. He was a diocesan priest, a Third Order Franciscan, also a renowned exorcist and a spiritual director. He had visions of Christ and the saints and had the gift of reading souls. He suffered the stigmata and also bore many other sufferings, which he endured patiently. It is said that he wrote his commentary on his knees, by the way. Even in life, he was famed for his holiness. St. Padre Pio once said to the pilgrims who came from Naples to see him, "Why do you come here if you have Don Dolindo in Naples? Go to him, he's a saint." Father Don was also accused of heresy for years due to misunderstandings and calumny said against him. His ministry was suspended in 1910. And then after a long investigation, he was cleared in 1937. And I just want to point out that's actually a good thing, because it shows that he is vetted. He is vetted by the church because they did open an inquisition into him. So the fact that he's cleared from that is good. We can have confidence in what we're going to read and learn about. He offered up his tremendous physical suffering and said, "I am totally poor, a poor nothing. My strength is my prayer. My leader is the will of God, which I let him take me by the hand. My security over the uneven path is the Heavenly Mother Mary." In fact, he was so poor his own family disowned him over it. However, despite all his ailments and sufferings, he had a great sense of humor about it, writing a medical prescription for his incurable ailments by saying, "Obedience to the will of God to be taken at all times with regular doses of Hail Marys." He also wrote of Our Lady as the mediatrix of all graces and co-redemptrix. The Church honors with particular veneration the Most Holy Virgin, the masterpiece of creation, the Mother of God, co-redemptrix of the human race, mediatrix of all graces, mother of all mankind, and the Church's most loving mother. It is very salutary to make Most Holy Mary known and loved, since deep and ardent devotion towards a mother so great is the infallible secret of the Christian life and eternal salvation. And that was in his writings called Slanzi di Amore by Don Dolindo Rutulo. He is particularly famous for his prayers and spiritual practice of surrendering everything to our Lord with complete trust and confidence. So you may have heard of the Surrender Novena that was written by him. I will cover later on at some point. I have 2 books on the way. Hopefully they'll get here. I think they'll be here Friday. about some of his meditations on the rosary specifically is what I want to talk about in this holy month of the rosary. So, despite his great humility and hidden life, he was also known as a prophet. In 1965, he stated that a new John will rise out of Poland with heroic steps to break the chains beyond the boundaries imposed by the communist tyranny. This came true under Saint Pope John Paul II, when Lech Walesa headed Solidarity, the Soviet bloc's first independent trade union that ultimately defeated communism in Poland. He was laid to rest in the church of San Giuseppe dei Nudi. He was always available to help the poor and sick. He promised that anyone in need could knock on his tomb if they wanted his help. Today, people go to his grave and knock thrice in the name of the Trinity, with confidence that Don Dolindo will help them. Concerning his so this is from the Angelic Pontiff Prophecy website. But anyway, concerning his prophecy, his Angelic Pontiff Prophecy, which has recently attracted attention, it is in his commentary of the Bible, which is La Sacra Scriptura. In particular, that part is in his comments on the book of Maccabees. So that's the book I really want to get my hands on, this commentary, but it's not translated and I can't find it in Italian either, but it's La Sacra Scrittura, Scriptura. So if anybody knows where I can get that, please help me out. This author says she discovered this particular set of his books was placed on the index of forbidden books in 1940. But they were cleared and taken off in 1966. And many cardinals and theologians are discovering what a spiritual treasure Father Dolindo Ruotolo's works are, and he has an open canonization process. So anyway, yeah, and so there probably is a conspiracy and was a conspiracy to suppress this because he talks a lot about pagan spirits plaguing the church and altars being raised to the pagan spirits, and this corruption in the church, especially by the leadership, is responsible for bringing about trials and sufferings in the book of the Apocalypse, as well as ultimately the triumphs. So it is a book of hope according to Father Don. And without further ado, let us get into this. So just background. So I think that it was 2 or 3 videos that I'm taking this first segment off of. I picked out the important parts and the parts that Father Don said, because the priest presenting them also gives his input and talks a lot. So I tended to try to skip over that part and just cover what Father Don has said. But just a little background, he wrote this commentary particularly during World War II on the Book of the Apocalypse. And again, this conference is by Padre Settimio and Maria Manelli. And so the introductionary piece is this. He says that the book presents the church in its trials and triumphs and glory. Father Don acknowledges that there are different systems of interpretation, of which he did seem to be familiar with because he goes over that in the beginning. And he also says that there is not there's not a unanimous consensus, I have trouble with that word, among the faithful on these matters, or even among the theologians. It speaks of the triumphs first of Jesus Christ in the church on earth. Now, this is his input. So, actually, I'm going to skip around a minute because it's written out of order in my notes here. But the systems of interpretation he does acknowledge. He acknowledges, let's see, that some people view the book of the Apocalypse as the whole history of the church. Then there's others who view it as an epoch system, like Venerable Holshouser, who we've gone over. He views the letters to the churches in the beginning as signifying different epochs. Father Don Dolindo's personal approach is that he believes it refers that certainly history fits within the book of the Apocalypse, and it will be relevant to every single generation. However, the difference between the specific time period that is being given in the apocalypse and the other periods is that these trials are crowned with triumph, and that's the distinguishing factor, the two triumphs that he focuses on. That's what makes it different and gives it a more futuristic tone. So he says it speaks of the triumphs, first of Jesus Christ and the church on earth. So that will be the triumph that we are facing right now in this generation, I would say. It's this purging, like we were told in Our Lady, many of them, but like Our Lady of Good Success, Bueno Suceso comes to mind. This whole purging of the church. Father Don speaks a lot about that. So, this whole purging of the church from its corrupt, rational, Freemasonic ideas and the infiltration of the communists and the pagans and the Masons and all that nonsense, resulting in the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, or the triumph of the church, the triumph of the Sacred Heart, these things, but it's an earthly triumph. A visible earthly triumph, and which will obviously then result in the period of peace ruled over by the Holy Pontiff and the Holy Monarch, the great monarch. So that's what he says. He sees there's two triumphs, clearly two triumphs in the book of the Apocalypse. The first is just what I said, the earthly triumph of Jesus Christ and the church. And then the second is the heavenly eternal triumph, which is only fully realized after the universal judgments, which is what causes the new heaven and the new earth to come down. So this is when everything is completely obliterated and there's a new heaven and a new earth that comes down, and that's outside of history and that's into eternity. So that eternity, that's the eternal triumph. The first triumph is just that, of the church, is just that, a triumph of the church here on earth. He also wants to point out that all the fathers and doctors of the church and saints have expressed difficulty with the mysteries of this book. A lot of it is because prophecy can only have true light when it is fulfilled, but he states that it is important to try to understand this book so that the Christian can prepare for the trials and triumphs, because it is a book of hope and encouragement for the persecuted Christians. And he says that it needs to be approached with humility. We shouldn't be upset if we can't figure the whole thing out. It will unfold as needed, and it needs to be approached with humility. So the people that think they have the entire book figured out, you don't. So stop. Okay. He states that he states that the soul is always waiting for the kingdom of God. Therefore, this book does have something in it for every generation. And it is in that way it is supposed to be mysterious to keep us on our toes. Elements of it can be applied to every generation, like I said. He states that the testimonies of the ancients cannot be disregarded as many want to do today. And the priest, I think this was the priest presenting it, not so much Don's words, but I think he was building off of what he was saying, that doubts about the authenticity of the book of the Apocalypse arrive in the 3rd century. But we have early witnesses like St. Justin Martyr and St. Irenaeus, who learned from St. Polycarp, who learned from St. John himself, to validate the authenticity of it. And so we're in a time period now where we see these heresies and we see these false ideas and this questioning of things. We're circling back to that, when in reality these issues have already been dealt with in the church if one just simply looks back at the councils and things like that. The church has addressed many of the issues that are being presented today as questions or a new way of thinking and things like that. The 7 churches represent, so now we're getting into, the 7 churches, now we're getting into the actual visions of the apocalypse as St. John saw it. And he's talking about specifically the 7 churches being addressed in the letters. He says they represent the universal church of the world and of the centuries. So that's the difference between, like Venerable Holshouser says that those address the epochs of the church. He's saying that they more so address represent the universal church of the world and of the centuries, as well as they could be broken down into epochs. And also, obviously, this way of them being relevant to all the churches of every age. Okay. And obviously, again, he reiterates the purpose is to describe the trials of the church and the triumph of Jesus. Now we go to chapter 1, and he speaks about the fact that as the world becomes pagan, the people no longer recognize and believe in the holiness of the saints and in the miracles associated with them. And so we note that this was at a time when Padre Pio and others like St. Gemma were regarded as having pathological illusions. It's this whole rationalism that we've talking about, and this whole secularism and things like this. The pagan state has closed itself to God, and this is this Masonic mindset that I always refer to. He calls it neo-paganism, paganism, but it's this rationalist, scientific, religion is outdated, it's superstitious mindset. He says the pagan state has closed itself to God and no longer recognizes the scourges that strike it and tries to cover them with facts and reason. The world cannot see chastisements as course corrections from God. And so he's already right off the bat saying that people aren't, the pagan world isn't going to take his writings seriously. He already knows that because they're not going to see these events that are going to unfold in the apocalypse as chastisements, as having any kind of spiritual meaning or divine intervention or anything like that. They're going to try to rationalize them away. They're going to try to provide scientific explanations for everything. And then he continues on, not only the world, but the church, members of the church have also been infected with this mindset, and they are going to try to rationalize and explain everything away. Instead of using divine words, they are going to use scientific human words. And that's where he transitions from his little introduction to Revelation 1:10, which is I heard a voice as loud as a trumpet. And he has a very interesting take on this. He says, voice like a trumpet. What does this mean? He explains that it is powerful as of the trumpets of war. He makes a military reference. He associates that powerful voice being like a trumpet to war. And also to announce the new times. The trumpet, already resounds through the teachings of the church. So we already have this trumpet going, but it will resound more powerfully when the shrill and croaking voices of science, who sought to replace the divine trumpets of the divine word with rationalist chatter, are eliminated from her bosom, meaning from the bosom of the church. So right off the bat, he is saying that this trumpet is going to resound more powerfully when the corruption is purged from the church. So that's interesting. He seemingly is pointing to the fact that this rationalist scientific mindset that has infected the church is stifling this trumpet blast, if you will. He comments that this trumpet voice is very powerful and very sweet and very wonderful. And then he also says, in the name, referring back to the corruption in the church, in the name of this scientism, they replace the divine words. In my input here, this is just my thoughts. I say, as the world becomes further pagan, the contrast between the culture and the church becomes more pronounced and more at odds with each other. And according to Father Dolindo, in his reference to the church, as the church becomes smaller by purging out the croaking and shrilling science voices, the voice of the church will then be unstifled, sort of thing. The trumpet will be able to blast louder. Then we move on to Revelation 1:12 through 16, in which he gives a description of this symbolism in the vision of the Son of Man. So I'm going to read that real quick, read that Bible verse, and that is Revelation 1:12. It starts with, Then I turned to see whose voice it was that spoke to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 gold lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands, one like a son of man, wearing an ankle-length robe with a gold sash around his chest. The hair of his head was as white as snow, and his eyes were like a fiery flame. His feet were like polished brass, refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing water. In his right hand he held 7 stars. A sharp, two-edged sword came out of his mouth, and his face shone like the sun at its brightest. And so we're not going to go over this line by line, mostly because the priest giving this conference didn't. He pointed out significant, interesting tidbits. Anyway, so why is the Son of Man shown in the midst of the lampstands? It's because he is in the midst of the churches represented by the lampstands as high priest and king. The lampstands, number 7, there's 7 of them, represent the complete number of churches from all places and every age. In Jewish tradition, the 7 branched lamps, if you will, so the arms, there was 7. There's one lampstand, and you think of a menorah, I guess. I don't know. Does that have 7 or 9? I think that has 9. But anyway, they had 7 branches, which had candlesticks with candles at the end, burned always in the temple as a symbol of worship and watchfulness in the absence of the people. So that's what these lampstands symbolize. It was symbolic of the faithful Jewish people who were not physically in the temple. It stood in for them. So the candlesticks, or the lamps, I should say, represent the church people as a whole throughout all of history and in the future. It acted as a symbol to represent the people's intention to worship even when they were physically not in the temple. And also because the church spreads light and warmth, and she is always supposed to be affectionately in service before God. He then moves on to the white hair, and that's a reminder to St. John. Now, he comments that this white hair is the best that St. John knew how to describe a supernatural feeling or a supernatural vision. He could probably only describe it in words that we know, which would be white. And it brings him back to the transfiguration. And it was one way that he was able to recognize that this vision was of Jesus, because he was one of the apostles present at the transfiguration. But he suspects the white symbolizes warmth, sweetness. And again, it's hard to describe because it's a supernatural vision. The eyes, the burning eyes, they describe infinite tenderness and an all-penetrating gaze, all-knowing, all-seeing, the true all-seeing eyes, not what the Illuminati want us to believe is the all-seeing eye, right? Then we have, and this is the most fascinating part, and again, I'm going to end it here after this, but I think it's a good transition into the next stuff. So 7 stars. Now I'll go back and read this so you can see they are in the hands of Jesus, in his right hands. In his right hand he held 7 stars. The 7 stars Father Don Dolindo suspects are light points described as stars. So he says light points in the hands are the tips or heads of the lamps, metaphor for the 7 angels of the 7 churches. So 7 is symbolic for perfection or all, inclusiveness of all. So all the angels of the churches, which Don Dolindo does understand to be bishops, not the actual spiritual angels, spiritual entities. So the bishops or the leaders of the diocese, he specifically sees them as the bishops, the church leadership. Don Dolindo thinks St. John describes the light points as stars because they were flickering, or another word would be trembling, like a star does in the night sky. This symbolizes human weakness, or the fact that some don't shine as brightly as others, sort of thing. But the fact that they are held in the hands of Jesus, the right hand, is to symbolize protection and love and the power of Jesus that is always behind them. On their own, they would go out, and obviously we know some are bad, but because of the power and protection of the hands of Christ, the church will not fail because of humanly weak leadership. Also, Why else would the bishops be symbolized by stars? It's because in the old times, stars were used as guides for travelers and sailors. So you would, set your compass in alignment and your maps in alignment with the constellations and the stars, and that's how you would get around. So direction for the journey, direction, guidance was based on the stars. And so he says they are, woe to the bishop that's not a saint. That's the words of Father Don Dolindo. They must not take from the faithful, but give to the faithful. The Christian layperson must live on earth. The Christian layperson must be concerned with earthly affairs, is what that means. We live in the world. We have to work. We have to raise families. We have to do all these things. But the bishop must live in heaven to shine the lights on the Christian. God is a symbol. I'm sorry, gold. Just the lampstands were made of gold. Gold is a symbol of the royal priesthood, which is how we can kind of link these things. And Christianity is made gold by the exercise of virtues. Very interesting. Here we are with these virtues. The bishop must be all splendor of the supernatural life. He must be transfigured into more of a heavenly creature than an earthly one. So we see right in book number 1, first couple paragraphs of Revelation, we see Father Don's understanding of things. Really, we can kind of tell where it's going now. And then we can kind of apply that to what we have going on right now. We can apply that to all the private revelation. We have Akita, bishop against bishop, and we have, countless apparitions talking about pray for the priests and bishops because they're corrupt, the corruption in the church. And so this is really a good amount of what is dealt with in the book of Revelation, but not only the corruption and the chastisements that will be brought about to purge that corruption, but also, more importantly, the triumph. And that's why it's a book of hope, and that's why I like Father Don does focus instead on the doom and gloom. He always keeps bringing it back into perspective that this is all about the triumph of God, the glory of God. That's what this is about. And I feel like that's probably why I'm being called so much right now to get this message out. And then also we see the significance of the virtues in here. He literally says Christianity is made gold by the exercise of virtues. And this is not something that we hear about as lay people. We don't hear about virtues. You have to go back and read the saints to figure out virtues, unless you listen to Father Ripperger. He talks about virtues, but there's very few church leaders that will talk about virtues, and mostly it's because they don't want to work for them themselves. So here we are, and I'm going to end it here. I want to keep these good, to the point, as professional as I can be, even though I'm not stuffy by any means, but I want to keep these good and to the point and concise. And we're at 33 minutes, so I am going to Joan of Arc Media out.